Hello, and thank you for tuning in today. This is the first podcast, YouTube cast, if you will, of Just Chillin, where we're going to discuss meteorology, all kinds of things going on in the world today involving meteorology, and interconnected sciences as well. My name's Chris Lasakis. I'm currently a PhD student at Mississippi State University, have been since August 2018. And I'm starting a new research project. I'll be working with Dr. Kathy Sherman Morris, and very glad to be able to work with her on some social science issues. Particularly, I think we'll be looking at tornado sirens and how tornado sirens are still beneficial, can still be used as a part of the warning process in the modern age. That's really exciting. It's something I'm passionate about, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what turns up with that. I had to give my old project up. It was involving working with some tornado forecasting metrics and techniques that I had developed over the last few years. But the good news is, with that material, I'm going to be putting it in a book. Here within the next 18 months to 2 years, we will turn out our first forecasting book with Eyes to the Sky. And that's really, I'm really looking forward to that. That's up and coming, and it's exciting news. So stay tuned for that for sure. A couple of items I just want to discuss with you today. I'm going to try not to let these little casts, if you will, go more than like 10 or 15 minutes. A couple of items. Primarily what it's going to be is just going to be me shooting the breeze about ongoings in meteorology, whether it be political. Of course, raw science and meteorology will be discussed a lot as well, meteorological events and so forth. A couple of things are kind of on my heart right now. One of those is forecasting hurricane-spawn tornadoes. Now, I haven't really done a whole lot of specific research on that topic, something I would like to do soon. But a couple of things that I've been thinking about with hurricane-spawn tornadoes is the size of the storm relative helicity envelope. The spatial region that the storm relative helicity coverage spans associated with landfalling tropical cyclones. There's been some research on that, and it's been shown that the more prolific tornado-producing tropical cyclones at landfall have much larger storm relative helicity envelopes covering a much larger area, piece of real estate. Another would be how quickly this tropical cyclone goes extratropical, or how quickly it weakens. And this goes back to Nolan and Gray from 1979, I believe, maybe 77. Don't quote me on that. But the late 70s, nonetheless, doing some the Gray with Nolan and Gray, of course, is Dr. William Gray, the hurricane specialist from Colorado State. But yeah, so how quickly the tropical cyclone weakens upon landfall is something interesting, and how quickly it goes extratropical, whether or not it merges. Number 3, whether or not it merges with a trough of low pressure. Trough of low pressure, of course, is defined as an elongated area of relatively low atmospheric pressure. You know them as being present anywhere from 850 millibars, 700 millibars, most of the time centered though around 5 to 300 millibars, right, in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere. Whether or not the tropical cyclone which has made landfall is going to merge with a trough, and this of course is going to boost the vorticity within the wave, and bring more storm relative helicity, a greater amount of spin, the greater potential for tornadoes. It will also interject dry air into the decaying tropical cyclone. So you'll get a more potential for an elevated mixed layer, right, an EML, to increase your potential instability, convective instability, increase your lapse rates if you get convection, things like that. A couple of others, maybe consider, this is not something I've done any research on, but it might be something to consider. The antecedent meteorological conditions at a location before the tropical cyclone, landfalling tropical cyclone moves in. So say for instance that a tropical cyclone is heading toward the northern Gulf Coast. Let's say it's heading right for the Florida Panhandle. what are the meteorological conditions before it arrives? Is the atmosphere unstable? Is there somewhat of a wave present? Is there a little bit extra wind shear there to begin with that could potentially help out? Of course, we know that tropical cyclones bring out their own environment, right? As they move into a region, they kind of commandeer the environment, so to say, and make their own atmospheric conditions or modify them way aside from what would otherwise be expected because of the potency of their entity. So yeah, a couple of thoughts on tropical cyclone tornadoes. Of course, there's a lot of other things, right, to consider than just these. But one of the interesting things to me is that, and you may have heard some researchers discuss this, how you don't always need cloud cover for severe weather. This is something that I'm going to be discussing in one of my books coming up in the next few years. And this is something that Dr. Kevin Upp and I used to talk about at UAH on how the cloud cover can actually, you've heard that it can shut down the Cape, that because you don't have surface heating, it significantly reduces the buoyancy, the atmospheric buoyancy, the Cape. And it does somewhat sometimes. However, not always. Say, for instance, if there's drier air above the boundary layer and the cloud cover is preventing solar mechanical mixing from the sun. So the sun causes thermals, right, and turbulence, which can shift or mix that drier air above the boundary layer down into the boundary layer and drop your dew points through the day. That's one way potentially that cloud cover could help, is if there's drier air above the boundary layer that would mix down. Clouds can help prevent that. Another thing is that the turbulence induced by the sun, the surface heating, boundary layer heating, through convective rolls and just general turbulence aside, can limit the vertical wind shear, okay, the bulk shear. If you think about it like this, or the total shear. If you think about it, so if you have totally still or winds blowing at 10 knots at the surface without clouds, and you have 50 knot winds at 500 millibars, you're going to have 40 knots of bulk shear, right? But let's say the winds, you get solar heating, you get turbulence, yada yada, and you generate 20 knots or 18 knots of wind at the surface. And then your bulk shear is going to actually go down because the winds at the surface are faster. So you have a less difference between the surface and 500 millibars then. So that's a thought on clouds and their influence on severe weather. So keep in mind that not every time it's cloudy is that going to preempt a severe thunderstorm or tornado threat. Always remember that and keep that in mind. Analyze every situation, right, specifically. Make it situation specific. Of course, storm relative winds are a huge player. Always keep in mind how storm relative winds can shape thunderstorms and the pre-convective environment, and how all that comes together. When the storm forms, the storm relative winds are what really shape the storm. So the cumulonimbus cloud is like the clay, and the wind shear is like the potter. And when you get the clay, then the wind shear that is present helps to determine the shape of that clay or that cumulonimbus cloud, and helps mold it into all the intricate designs that it assumes. Okay, so whenever you have like a really strong anvil, for instance, you've got really nice, strong, pronounced upper level storm relative winds, anvil level storm relative winds, say maybe 40, 50 knots or higher, up into 60 knots maybe even. In real extreme cases, you get over about 70 knots, and that can actually be too strong. So your mid and upper level mesocyclone will struggle. And the lower one will as well, the lower portion of the meso, because your precip is getting ejected so far away from the incipient mesocyclone that it's hard to get the low level twisting and stretching of the updraft, stretching and tilting of the updraft, mostly tilting, right, due to the reduced amount of water load within the thunderstorm cloud. And so that can help affect tornado genesis as well, can help prevent it, if the upper level storm relative flow is too strong. Okay, so there's just a couple of thoughts for you today. I see we've already run 10 minutes. These things go by so quickly. So yeah, vorticity spin up being prevented somewhat due to the upper level storm relative winds being too strong, and effectively, as a lot of meteorologists refer to it as, or a lot of aficionados, the storm being quote unquote torn apart or sheared apart. You'll hear about that a lot. And what you really need to be looking for in those cases is your storm relative winds at any one particular level or between layers of the atmosphere. Okay, always remember that storm relative wind will affect whether or not a thunderstorm will be quote unquote sheared apart or torn apart. There's that, and let's pick one more topic to discuss. So squall line thunderstorms, or MCSs, bow echoes, loops, all of that, QLCSs in the summertime, late spring. Really, they can happen any time of the year, right? We know that in the deep south, roughly 45 to 50% of our tornadoes come from these QLCSs, or squall line thunderstorm events. This was actually a part of my master's thesis that I did under Dr. Kevin Nuff at UAH, ending back in 2018. That's when I got my master's degree. We found in the deep south, in Dixie Alley, roughly 50% of our tornadoes here come from QLCSs. And how fast the QLCS moves, right, determines the storm relative helicity. So remember back in the mid and late 80s, from like 86, 87, 88, Lilly was a researcher, and also Dr. Davies-Jones, Robert Davies-Jones. Lilly and Davies-Jones developed the concept of storm relative helicity. And storm relative helicity has some caveats, in that only about 30 samples, about 28 samples of storms, supercell thunderstorms, were sampled in sampling the efficiency of storm relative helicity as a tornadic environment indicator. And so only 28 samples were gathered, primarily from the plain states, which shows you that not a lot of research was done in the southeast pertaining to the values of storm relative helicity, and also that it was primarily given or applied as a mid-level rotation indicator, all right, for right-moving supercells. So if a supercell turns to the right of the mean wind, that's a whole nother discussion, the mean wind and how it's found and which layer to use as the mean wind, and do storms always deviate to the right of the mean wind? When can they go faster? When can they go slower? Yada, yada, yada. And just keep right on going. There's so much to talk about, folks. You can tell it's a fascinating topic. But yeah, so Lilly and Davies-Jones, 28 supercells were sampled and applied to their study, only for right movers, and the storm relative helicity, or as it's sometimes known as storm relative environmental helicity, only for right movers and only indicative of the potential for rotation in the mid-levels, not in the low levels as we've used it more recently. And I'm not saying it can't be used for that. I believe it can, and sometimes very efficiently. Of course, you have to consider all other atmospheric parameters, right, aside, not just storm relative helicity. How buoyant is the atmosphere? How water-loaded is the atmosphere? What's the potential for entrainment, dry air entrainment, in both updrafts and downdrafts, right? Because entrainment can happen in both stages, both in updrafts and downdrafts, given different kinematic situations. And so, yeah, there's that. And so finding out the sweet spot with storm relative helicity, what layer it's best used in, is it different for squall lines or supercell environments? Yada, yada, yada. Those are all, what's the mean wind? Calculating the storm relative winds from different environments, predicting storm motion. All of those things are so intense and so time consuming and calculative. And so those are all issues that we've had to mull through in the atmospheric sciences and meteorology. Okay, so largely though, what I'd also like to mention is the speed of the squall line can change dramatically. Supercells, pretty much we know how fast they're going to go, unless they're being affected by a bore, a gravity wave, some sort of external influence. We generally know, cold pool, etc., how fast they're going to go. Oftentimes if they're elevated, they'll go faster than if they were surface-based. You know, determining whether or not a supercell is elevated or a thunderstorm is elevated is determined upon the effective inflow layer. Lower the inflow layer, does the supercell draw in air from the surface? That'll help you determine whether or not the cell is elevated and has tornado potential. Okay, I know some folks don't like using that effective inflow layer principle, and I can understand there's some drawbacks. There's also positives, as with most any metric in meteorology, right? Most any of them have that. You can call most any of them out because they've got flaws. None of them are perfect. But yeah, so squall line has more potential throughout in a widespread, you know, given many different meteorological situations, to move faster than the mean wind would suggest because of cold pull effects and the rear inflow jet and all that kind of thing taking shape, mesovortices and stuff, which can generate tornadoes in and of themselves from that, and pressure perturbations, which can cause damaging rotating wind events that are not tornadic. We saw one of those during Vortex Southeast. Yeah, just a couple of things I'd like to talk about, folks, here today in Just Chillin', episode 1. Stay tuned. There's going to be a whole lot of more righteous stuff to come. We'll talk about some fun stuff. And please, if you have comments, questions, and all that good stuff, let's just start a discourse. Okay, that's the main thing I'd like to do here. In meteorology, I miss it. I miss having that conversation, that depth of insight and relationship. And so let's most certainly do that, and we can have like a little roundtable discussion or something in the comments. Who knows what might happen. Okay, so thank you so much, and y'all take care. Bye-bye.